In carving the lattice background of the design of this tissue box cover, I ran across a couple of things that I thought would be worth sharing. One of which is right along the top here. This is a thin line that I'm going to be cutting, and it goes almost right up against the seam where the two pieces of wood are glued, but it doesn't go quite up, so there's actually a little tiny strip of this grain going this way that I'm not cutting. And on the first side that I cut it, I think it was this one, I ended up cutting a little bit too deep, and some of this grain, which ends up being really short grain, started kind of pulling away, and I had to glue it and put that back. So it's just gonna kind of demonstrate here the first orientation, the first direction that I'm going to go is away from that short grain. And so just making sure to be very careful, apply gentle pressure, don't go any deeper than I need to, and kind of just general pattern of straight line carving here to keep it right on that tight margin that I'm looking for. And normally I would go all the way around, but just for the purpose of demonstration here, I'm gonna just do this one part. But on this cut now especially, I want to make sure I don't go too deep. If I go deeper than I need to an undercut, I'm going to start ripping off this wood that has very little support under it. So just very light pressure, just enough to remove this strip of wood, and don't undercut at all. A little bit of distraction there as I went through that darker grain, broke off. Kind of lost focus on what I was doing, but that's the general idea there, and you can see that I was able to preserve this wood up top. So if you're doing items that have glued seams and you're carving stuff around the seam, just something to be aware of to make sure that you're not disturbing the integrity of the wood along that seam, and especially paying attention to grain direction, such as in this case. Now, if I were going straight across this, it wouldn't really be a big deal. You might have a little bit of a hang up with the knife going across the glue between those pieces of wood, but that was just one kind of little gotcha that I ran into. And the other thing is this circle that goes around here. Again, it's a closed figure, continuous and smooth loop, so I want to make sure that I capture that well in the carving. And one big issue tends to be the transition with the grain, as usual. And if I do this in one continuous carve, on the inside here, I'm probably going to end up cutting it off the corner a little bit, have a flat spot, and as I come around the outside, the knife's going to get caught up in the grain, and it's going to be a little bit too wide as I come back in here. So in order to avoid that, I make all my cuts with the grain, but that means I'm going to have to make multiple cuts that line up to each other. So I'll show some of the tricks that I use to help that work. One thing is I start the cut here. So in this spot, there's this circle, but then this line is also coming in. And so I don't have to be perfectly on that line. I can kind of be a little bit low and come up and draw the knife out until it gets on this line perfectly. And I'm also going past the grain on that. I don't want to start right in the middle. It's just, it kind of gives me more wiggle room if I go to this spot. So put the knife in there, get about the depth I need, find that line, and now I'm kind of already in the groove, so to speak, as I get to with the grain side of the cut, and keep consistent pressure on the knife. Try to go as smoothly, but here, I stop to rotate the board. Keep the knife blade pulled against the wood. If you can do that, it'll help make the cut smoother. Whereas if I were to release the knife, then it would be more prone to an issue. So right there, I'll go ahead and stop because that's where the grain transitions. So then on this side, same thing, start in that darker spot, find my line and depth, and just do my best to follow that line precisely. Kind of helps to move the board underneath my hand. And stop right there. So now I can come back and I'm going to go in the opposite direction, and I find that for doing these lines, especially where it's a very fine delicate thing, I like to use my other hand to kind of give a little bit of steadiness and, I don't know, resistance or so to the knife along these cuts, and just go in this same direction with the grain. And I'm certainly in no rush on this, but I also want to move the knife quickly enough that it's a fluid movement and not, you know, starting and stopping, not giving the knife time to kind of wiggle around in the cut. So come back here and do this side. Okay, and then same kind of deal on the inside cut, but in order to avoid if I start the knife right here at this transition spot and come down, I still might get some of the grain splitting. So what I like to do instead is actually start inside the cut that I'm going to be removing, inside the chip, and kind of come at a slight angle. So this is actually with the grain instead of straight along the grain. And what I can do then is come onto the line, and now by the time I get onto the line, it's no longer straight with the grain, and so I can avoid that grain running with the knife. And then again, I'm going to stop it right in that intersection again. So same deal, doing the same cut on the opposite side here. Start in the chip, kind of come a little bit sideways onto the grain, onto the line, and then come along. Stop in the intersection. And then come back here, and so now I've got kind of a half sliver. I already removed some of that wood, so by being thinner and having some space here, it helps the wood to have some space to kind of move into, relieve the internal pressure of the wood, and so I don't get the splitting of the grain. So some of that stuff's just kind of things to think about and play around with, an experience of kind of how the wood behaves and why it's doing what it's doing. So I do have a little bit of a seam there between those, so I'm going to try to tidy that up. There we go. And then do the same over here. So normally I prefer to do things in continuous cuts, continuous direction, rather than trying to deal with making these multiple cuts and trying to get them to line up perfectly. But I found that with design like this with a chip like this, it just, at least I'm able to get better results using these techniques than trying to go consistently around. And yeah, I don't see any seam there. We got clean cuts on the grain transitions there. We got seamless circle all the way around. So I'm happy with that. That's how I'm able to do that. And things to keep in mind or try out if you've got a similar design to carve.